We try to identify the information gaps in the public debate, and then we provide facts from our in-house research to fill those gaps. And the second part of our activity is mostly on trying to making things happen on the ground. So Kate was talking about catalysts, and that's what we try to do. So not really do things ourselves, but put the right people in a room together to discuss and actually take actions. So I feel a bit dirty after Matthew's presentation because we actually focus on low carbon at ClimateWorks, but I'm going to try and rehabilitate low carbon economy and so that we're all just targeting the same goals. So, what? Yes. So first I wanted to put things a bit back into their context. So this is a graph that shows the projections of emissions between now and 2020. So I don't know if you can see the top wedge very well, but it goes up quite a bit. So the situation at the moment is that we have a bipartisan commitment to reach a 5% reduction by 2020. And what you can see on this graph is that getting the 5% reduction is actually just a small part of the task of achieving this target. What the big part of the task is to actually curb the growth of emissions that we're still going towards in business as usual. So the emissions are still planned to grow by 24% by 2020. And this number actually increases with every year that we wait. It has already increased the total number of megatons by 20 between 2010 and 2011. And we can expect that number to grow further if we don't do anything. The growth is mostly driven by economic growth and population growth, and things like that, and especially the growth in the mining and gas sectors. So then what about what scientists tell us we should do? 25% is the minimum that scientists recommend to curb the effect of climate change. And because when you hear 25% as compared to 5%, it sounds like it's 5 times harder. But actually it's not true, because as we were saying, the biggest task is actually to just get stable. Getting to 25% is only around 70% harder than getting to 5%. And this is really something that is important to remember. It's not that hard to increase that target above the 5%. So, in 2010, ClimateWorks Australia published their first report, which is called Low Carbon Growth Plan for Australia. It's a low carbon. So what we did is we looked at all the opportunities we had to reduce emissions in Australia with the current technologies and without any significant change in behavior or industry mix. So we're not asking people to close plants or to turn off the light and live in the dark. It's just really to use more efficient light bulbs and to just use your resources more rationally. So we've presented the results in the shape of a cost curve. So for those who haven't seen that before, the horizontal axis represents the amount of emissions that you can reduce. So each box on the cost curve is an activity, and the width of that box is how many emissions it can reduce. And then the vertical axis represents the cost of doing that activity. So everything that's below the zero axis is actually things that are profitable. So things that deliver savings to people that implement them. And then the activities are ordered by increasing cost on the graph. And what we found is that you actually have enough opportunities to reach the 25% target by 2020 in Australia. This is feasible, and this does not cost as much as people think. It actually comes at a reasonable cost. If you look at what it takes, it turns out that the cost curve kind of neatly divides itself in 3 areas. So the left side of the cost curve, things that are below the axis, are mostly energy efficiency. So just reducing our use of energy to produce the same outputs. The medium part of the cost curve is mostly land activities, so planting trees or improving the way we deal with our agricultural land. And the right part of the cost curve is more like the power sector, so transferring to more renewable energy. As you can see, this is quite high cost, but it's mostly because everything that's on this cost curve is above business as usual. So anything that is currently going to be done through policies that exist, including the 20% renewable target, is not on that curve. Nothing in that curve will happen if we don't do further action. So I'm not going to talk about each box on the curve, but just so you know, each box corresponds to actually its own little model with assumptions on the costs and volumes and so on, and there's really significant research that went behind this plan. You can find all the details on our report if you're interested. So then, looking at what we can do is just the first step. What we really were keen to understand is what you need to do to make this happen. And the first step that we took was to try and understand why it's not happening now. So we looked at all the barriers that currently lock the emissions reductions activities. So the first one is the pretty obvious one, is just the price. Some things are just not profitable, so people are not interested in doing them. But then there's a lot of other barriers that are not just price. As you can see on the curve, there were already a few things that were profitable, that are profitable today and still are not happening. So then we looked into what are those other barriers. There's barriers that, for example, are capital constraints or investment priorities. Sometimes people don't have the money to invest in the technology that is needed to improve emissions, or people prefer to invest that money in other more profitable activities. And then there's problems of information. People don't necessarily know what they need to do, or the people that know are not necessarily the ones taking the decisions. And then there's problems in the market structure or supply. For example, if you don't have the technology that you need readily available, it's really much more effort to take that action. So when the government announced their carbon price package last year, we were quite impressed by what they did, especially because we thought that they included a lot of complementary measures that were addressing all those barriers. However, when we listened to the public debate, everybody was only focusing on the impact of the carbon price itself and not talking at all about all these other measures that were included in the package. So that's one of the information gaps that I was talking about before. We thought, oh, that's maybe somewhere where we can make a difference by actually trying to quantify the impact that those complementary measures would have, because we had the feeling that it would be actually really significant in addition to the carbon price itself. So for those of you that are not very familiar with the carbon price package, so as I said, it includes a carbon price, of course, that impacts directly on around 500 businesses and indirectly through increased electricity prices in particular. But then it also includes direct financial support, so there's lots of grants programs, especially for companies or buildings and councils. And then there's some information programs, especially for SMEs or all the people that would have increased difficulty for access to information. And then there were also some governance and regulation to try and work, for example, on perverse incentives and things like that. So what we did is we developed a methodology that would look at all the more quantifiable factors in this carbon price package, but also the more qualitative ones, and try to quantify all of them. So the first thing we did is look at how does the carbon price package impact on just the cost, the investor cost. So how many things change in their profitability. So we looked at the impact of the carbon price itself, so on those 500 industries or so that are going to pay it, but also on the indirect impact of it. So how does it change the profitability of, for example, things that reduce electricity usage for people that will pay a higher price of electricity. And we also looked at how the grants and low-interest loans and so on were also impacting on profitability. And then the second thing, which was which hadn't been done before, was that part on how can we quantify the impact of the non-price barriers. So what we did is for each of the activities on our cost curve, we defined which ones were the biggest barriers that were currently locking those opportunities. And we decided to quantify the barriers by using a sense of coverage and strengths. Coverage is the idea of how many of the stones are blocked by this barrier. And strengths is how hardly is it blocked by the barrier. Some barriers are not that hard to break, but some of them are pretty much like a wall and nobody will be able to do the activity. And then what we did is we looked at how the complementary measures acted on those barriers. In some cases, you can imagine some policies would completely remove the barrier, but for a small subset of people. For example, if you have a grant covering the whole price of your activity, that will be the case. And some other activities will be more acting on a whole range of people, but in a more subtle way. So then the strength will be reduced a bit, but for the whole coverage. And the results of our analysis showed that if implemented well, the carbon price package could deliver up to 124 megatons CO2, which means by 2020, which means more than 3/4 of the 5% target, which is a lot more than what the Treasury modeling was talking about, or than other modeling. So that means Australia would need to rely a lot less on international offsets. And because our plan doesn't even include behavior change or voluntary improvements, then you could even imagine going up all the way to the 5% target without relying on international offsets. So a big part of that was because it was making a lot more things profitable. So in the old cost curve, there was only maybe 1/4 of the curve that was below the axis, whereas after the carbon price package, there's more than 160 megatons, which is the 5% target, that has become below the line. It makes activities even more profitable when they were profitable before, and it makes a lot of things that were moderate cost become profitable. And that delivers, that can deliver a lot of savings to the Australian economy. Today, even before the carbon price, those a few boxes on the left can actually deliver up to 5 billion of savings in the 2020 energy bills, so per annum, to Australian businesses and Australian households. And this is a number that is quite realistic because the Energy Efficiency Opportunity Program, which is the reporting, mandatory reporting of energy efficiency opportunities by industries, by the largest industries in Australia, already identified $1 billion in annual financial savings for companies at mid-cycle. So now the result at the end of the cycle would be much higher because they've had to look at more opportunities. And it's not only savings, it's also jobs, because a lot of the energy efficiency, for example, implementation results in new jobs in green industries. So there's a few things that we need to really keep in mind. The first one is this is the potential of the carbon price package. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen without any further action from us. The first thing we need to do is just to make sure that the government delivers the most of what it can deliver. And then there's also a potential to build on the momentum that the carbon price package will create. This toothy smile, as we call it, is just what remains on the cost curve after the carbon price package. And as you can see, there's still a lot of things that are below the axis. So there's still a lot of potential to implement actions that will save money and that are currently not taken up. So we really believe that this is an opportunity to continue to build on that momentum and really grasp all of those opportunities. Oops, that's not what I want to do. So another thing that we're looking at the moment is to actually start thinking about how we will measure progress. So it's really nice to think, oh, we think we're doing progress, but if you can't actually see what's going well, what's not going well, and what's happening concretely, then it's really hard to improve your trajectory. And with the carbon price package come a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of challenges. As you know, not all sides of the political parties are really pro the carbon price package, and there's currently a risk that it could be cancelled if there was a change of government. And this risk is actually made bigger because of the fact that in the first few years of its operation, there will be very little evidence of the activity that will be undertaken by companies. So only 500 companies require carbon permits, and there's no trading in the first few years. And it will be very hard to actually understand what activity is being taken internally. So what companies do to reduce their energy use, to reduce their emissions, their process emissions, and so on. The only reporting will be done through EO or NGERS, but again, it will be very hard to distinguish what's just been done because of a change of activity or because it was business as usual and what's due to the carbon price package. For the land, there will be a bit more tracking, but it's something that takes time, and sometimes people don't actually report their activity until a few years have passed since they planted their first trees or set up their first projects. There's kind of a lag between the first day of activity and the actual results or reporting of it. And for power sector, it's unlikely that there will be new investments in the first few years following the carbon price. It will be more internal planning or energy efficiency and things like that. So again, quite hard to follow. So the project we're starting now is to actually set up a framework to measure progress and to capture not only the outcomes, but also the early signs of activity and the drivers of activity. So this iceberg on the right shows you what we mean by that. So the top of the iceberg is the emissions reduction. So that's something that we are quite good at measuring. But then the activity underneath is, so how many projects have been undertaken, but also, especially for long-term projects, which take quite a lot of time to show the results, how many projects have been approved? So how much budget has been committed by companies and so on? And how many feasibility studies have been done? So are people looking at it more? Are people looking at it less? We don't really know unless we can get into those companies and know what they're doing. And then in terms of the drivers, it's really understanding, so emissions have decreased or increased, but what is driving this? So is it a change in the economic context, or are there government policies that have been efficient or inefficient? Are the barriers moving? Can we see slowly that there's less and less barriers locking different activities? And that's a sign that in the future, more activity will be happening. So the goal of doing this is, there's a few goals. The first one would be to identify the early action of companies, to really be able to make the case for the carbon price package, and also maybe if, as we think it would be, there's more action that happens at a lower cost than people are all forecasting, then be able to make the case for a more ambitious target and more action in Australia. Then we also would like to create a guide for future policies, so identify what's working and what's not working, and really be able to build on the knowledge of the past actions. And also not only for governments, but also for companies to look at this and see opportunities of areas where they could also play a role in unlocking more activities and create a market for themselves. And to create this, some of it will come from available data, but a lot of it will just come from surveys of companies or councils or anything, just really getting what's happening below the surface that's not visible for most people. So we are quite keen to, if you're interested in participating in our projects, that would be really great. So that will be all for me today. If you want more information or detail about any thing that I've talked about today, it's all on our website in our publications. And it's now time for questions.
And then we're going to